Alright, it's now been nearly a month since the historically exciting card that was Colby Covington versus Joaquin Buckley, and we're here with what may be an historically awful card in UFC Fight Night Dern versus Ribas 2. Now, it's never a good sign when you look and you see the news that a fight night is going to be headlined by the number 6 in the women's strawweight division versus the number 8 in the women's strawweight division. Not to mention, this is a rematch that nobody really wanted, nobody really cared for, and it's headlining this card. But let's look down this card. We've got in the co-main event a 40-year-old Santiago Ponzinibbio coming off of two losses, I believe, versus another old veteran in Carlston Harris, also coming off of a loss. Where where are the stakes in this matchup? This is supposed to be the co-main event. Usually, in a fight night card, we'll get a very relevant main event. Maybe a guy that's going to be fighting for a title soon. Not here. And then in the co-main event, we'll get two ranked fighters, or at least one ranked fighter versus a fun prospect. No, here we got two kind of irrelevant veterans that may have a boring kind of tit for tat striking on the feet. Okay. In the feature fight, we've got Cesar Almeida versus Abdul Razak Al Hassan. Actually, a decent fight. I'll give it that. That's fine. Another decent fight on here, to be honest. Chris Curtis versus Roman Kopylov. Should be fun, unless Chris Curtis stinks it up, which he can sometimes. But I actually believe in that to be a fun fight. I will watch that. These top two fights, I'll probably tune in for the Ponzinibbio fight. I guarantee I will not be watching this co-main event. And then we've got the fourth fight on the card, Christian Rodriguez versus Austin Bashi. It's never a good sign when one of the most interesting fights on the card is a guy straight off the Contender Series who really hasn't fought anybody relevant yet. Now, Austin Bashi is only 23. I have a lot of faith in this guy. He does look to be a high-skilled, next-generation type of guy. So, ironically, this is a fight that I'm excited for. Punahele Soriano versus Uros Medic. It's fine. I'm sure Uros Medic will just knock him out, which might be fun. But again, a fight with pretty low stakes. Jose Johnson versus Felipe Bunes, low stakes. Marco Tulio versus Ior Poteria, should be fun actually, but again, not the most relevant matchup. Thiago Moises versus Trey Ogden, two older guys, win, lose, doesn't really matter. Maybe a fun fight. Preston Parsons versus Jacoby Smith. Jacoby Smith, another good prospect, actually. Nah, don't care. Magomed Sulov versus Bruno Lopez. Another kind of irrelevant fight between two guys that are never going to get to the title. Don't care. Decent. So overall, it's a pretty bad fight night card. But what's even worse, in my opinion, what's going on with UFC 312 right now? We've got the Dricus du Plessis versus Sean Strickland headliner, which I believe is a good fight, maybe the right fight to make. I think that probably could be Chimaev, and that would be a more interesting fight. But it was a razor close fight in the first one. Sean Strickland does sort of deserve it. Maybe Chimaev wasn't ready for some reason, so this is fine. A little bit less intriguing in my opinion than the first fight. I'm just not that much of a fan of seeing rematches, especially when not much has happened between them, and especially when there is a more compelling new matchup for the champion available. But it's fine. We finally got Zhang Wei Li coming back versus what's actually a pretty interesting contender, in my opinion. So as far as women's fights go, pretty interesting. And then we've got Justin Tafa versus Taliesin Teixeira. If I'm right, this is a guy straight off the Contender Series in the feature fight. That just doesn't seem right to me. We've got Jimmy Crute in 2025 versus Rodolfo Bellato, also on the main card right now. I know there are supposed to be one or two fights that can be added to this. In my opinion, the only fights that can save this card are Jack Della Maddalena. I don't even know who else you would add to this to make this a great card. Maybe you add like Volk versus Diego Lopez in the feature fight or something. We've got a guy making his debut in Jonathan McAuliffe, a guy that's 7-1, I believe, against Kevin Jesse, a guy who just got smoked by Brian Battle. it could be fun. Not the most intriguing stakes wise. We've got Jack Jenkins versus Gabriel Santos. Yeah, pretty fun Australian fighter. We've got Ray Saruya, good prospect, versus Stuart Nickel. It's a good fight. We've got Cody Hallen versus Alexandre Topuria. That is interesting. I'll give this card that. I'm excited to see Topuria's brother. Now, I've heard he's not nearly as good as Ilya, but I haven't really seen him fight at the UFC level, so you have to take everything you've heard with a grain of salt. Quillan Salkild. I don't know much about him. I know he's making his debut against Anshul Jabli, guy who kind of got exposed recently. Tom Nolan versus Borshev, decent fight. Wang Kong lost all her hype versus Bruno Brazil, who's pretty exciting for a women's fighter. But you know what this card is missing? And this card is missing? Aside from Duplessis versus Sean Strickland, neither Fight Night Dern versus Ribas or UFC 312 have a single ranked male fighter on the entire card, aside from this championship fight between Dricus Duplessis and Sean Strickland. Now, that doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem right that we get these cards that are just not good, or at least not to the level that they should be for the greatest MMA promotion by far. Why does it seem like they're not putting effort into some of these events? Why does it seem like they don't care about some of these events? And what can be done about that? Let's look into it. So, when you think about what really makes fight cards interesting, what really draws people in, it's two things: good prospects and ranked fights, right? Because rankings are a clear sign of relevance. It's a good system that determines exactly who is going to fight for the title and win. At least in theory, we know that high ranking means that these are some of the best fighters in the division. It means that they are close to a title shot, and it means that wins, losses all have ramifications for the entire division. So, where are all these ranked fighters? Why are we getting a fight night to open the year with 0 ranked male fighters? Why does UFC 312, second pay-per-view of the year, have 0 ranked male fighters outside of the main event? So far, I know there are at least 1 or 2 more fights they want to add on that card. But still, I believe a pay-per-view should at least have 3 or 4 fights that do have ranked fighters in them outside of the main event. So, let's do some math. There are exactly 120 ranked men's fighters in the UFC. You've got 15 plus a champion, actually. So actually it's going to be 128. 15 times 8, 120 plus the 8 champions. 0 ranked men's fighters this weekend. 0 aside from the champion and Sean Strickland at UFC 312, which is just ridiculous. Why is that going on? Let's see. Is the roster too big? So one thing that I've heard that's a problem is sometimes fighters want to fight, they want to have an opponent, but each card has a limit of the number of fighters that can be on it. The UFC isn't going to just put more fights on that card because they have pre-established limits. They have pre-planned numbers of events each year. They have times that they're going to start, times that they're going to end, and they have to try to fit approximately 580 fighters in the entire roster into 12 months of events. Most people are going to want to fight more than once a year. There are approximately 100 women fighters in the UFC, so that's, if they, assuming they each fight twice a year, that's like 100 women's fights. And fighters have to wait to get booked, which makes sense for kind of like irrelevant fighters that the UFC really have no place for, guys that kind of like win one, lose one. Maybe they're outside the rankings still. But if you're a guy like, remember how Khamzat Chimaev used to want to fight like every week? I believe if you're an interesting fighter like that, or a ranked guy, an up-and-coming prospect that's drawing a lot of attention, you should be able to fight as often as you want. I believe that the UFC should make that a priority. I believe that certain fighters should get priority when it comes to how they're getting their fights booked, right? I believe if you want to fight, if you've been winning, you should be able to fight. There should be a place for you. So that being said, is the roster too big? Do we really need 580 fighters when only 15 in each division are going to be relevant and ranked? Now, that being said, obviously we do need some space outside the rankings for the rankings to even mean anything for up and coming guys to make a name for themselves. Instead of having like 50 people in a division, why don't we have 20, 30, maybe even 35? That way we just cut out the lowest part of the division. Older guys that never really established themselves as anything great in the UFC. Younger guys that aren't clearly going to be anything in the UFC that come in and just take a bunch of losses. Maybe we stop accepting everybody from the Contender Series that has a decent performance. Maybe we have a bit higher stakes. Maybe we don't take in the fat guy that got a lucky knockout on the Contender Series, right? And that way we have more time for the really relevant, interesting fighters to get their time to shine, to get their time to build their resume, build interest, build hype. And then another problem, I believe some cards are just overstacked, leaving less for the rest. Like these Saudi cards, obviously it's very fun to have those really good cards, but not at the cost of having a month of just slop like the fight night we're getting this weekend. It's not worth it. I'd rather see you spread some of those good fights out so that we can have something to look forward to on every single card, right? Because sometimes when you have like 7, 8 great, interesting fights on one card, it ended up getting overlooked, some of these good fights, when if they were just on another card that doesn't have that same spotlight, they'd be the ones getting that spotlight. Then that card would still have something interesting to look forward to. And when I talk about that, these are fights like 298, 299, 300, which was insane looking back. Those were 3 insanely stacked pay-per-views in a row. And then look what happened with cards like 301, right, 297. Those cards were absolutely awful. Those cards were not something that anybody would want to buy for $80. And I'm afraid UFC 311 is a similar type of card, although that is an amazing card that I am looking forward to. I'd be just as happy having, maybe you take the Umar versus Merab fight, you put that as a co-main event in 312. All of a sudden everybody's complaining a lot less about UFC 312 and everybody's still thrilled for UFC 311. So maybe we're just overstack some cards. And then also let's talk about inactivity. If we are going to cut out the bottom half of each division and just leave the top fighters, they are going to have to be more active to take up that slack, right? They are going to still have to fill out these cards, and I think that's something that you can do. I think that a fighter should aim to fight 3 times a year and fight at least 2 times a year as a bare minimum, barring injuries, obviously. Visa issues, all of that stuff. I know sometimes it's hard. I know it's hard to get fights, but it's going to be less hard to get fights if you cut out the bottom half of the division. Assuming ranked fighters average 2.5 fights a year, if they try to get 3, sometimes end up getting 2. That's going to be a minimum of 150 fights a year involving at least one ranked male fighter. If you get a lot of fights with unranked guys fighting ranked guys, that could jump up to like 200 plus. That's not to mention unranked prospect versus unranked prospect, which are also interesting fights, and champions aren't even factored into this, so that's even more very relevant men's fights. In 2024, there were 42 events throughout the entire year. That's more than 3 fights that have this ranked relevance per card, more than enough for multiple on each card. I'd love to see that. So let's talk about the solutions. Let's say no ranked fighters on prelims of cards, right? We can save that only for main cards. That solves a bit of the stacking issues. Now, for really like landmark events like UFC 300, I understand that it is cool and it is important to have those great matchups on undercards. Like we were seeing guys like Piotr Jan, Yuri Prochazka on the undercard in that, which is fine for something like UFC 300, something that happens once every 8 to 10 years. I think the prelims should be kept only for prospects, guys that are working their way up, and unranked veterans. That way the prelims are still interesting. You still have those guys that draw interest for other reasons, but the main card is saved only for those ranked type of fights. And then I think we do need to cut more fighters, unfortunately. I know that sounds like kind of a mean thing to say, But a lot of these guys aren't making much money anyway. They'd probably be better off, to be honest, maybe trying to find another promotion where they're going to be making similar money, or just fight for fun, go on with their lives, go to college, go to trade school, something like that, you know. Um, Unless they're legends, prospects, or contenders, what purpose are they really serving for the UFC, right? Maybe they have super fun fights. That's a good reason to keep somebody around. But if you're like a 36-year-old guy, never won a belt, never been a top contender, you're kind of like a win one, lose two, win two, lose one type of guy. You don't have a fun style. Why are the UFC keeping hold of this guy? Um, I'm not sure. But I think there are a lot of ways that the UFC could just take more pride in the cards that they put out, and we'd benefit from it. They would benefit from it. I don't understand why we get these bad cards, and I hope it gets better. But anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know if there's another reason some of these cards are bad. Let me know if you think these cards aren't bad. Let me know if you think these cards are awful. And have a great day.